Welcome to the studios of Calaveras County Public Access Television. My name is David Bowman. I'm a host today for a public discussion about a very important topic that's facing our community with regards to our water. My guest today is Joel Metzger, who's the general manager for the Utica Water and Power Authority. For simplicity's sake today, we're going to just call it Utica. Joel, welcome. Great to see you and be with you.
David, thanks for being here, and I'm really glad to be with you today.
We're going to be talking about something that sounds really complicated called the FERC Conduit Exemption application. And we will jump into that in a few minutes. But before then, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about Utica and its background and its history and its role in the community.
Yeah, so I'm a local, born and raised in this area. I grew up in San Andreas, and my parents were very vested in this community. My dad, Randy Metzger, was a long-time Calaveras County Assessor's Office employee.
I remember his name on my tax bills, maybe?
You might have seen it on the tax bill. He was an appraiser for most of my life, and then he was the elected assessor for the end of his career over there. But his love was farming, and still is, and so you may have had some Metzger wine or some Metzger tomatoes or other veggies over the years.
I have.
So many people have really enjoyed that produce. So I grew up on the farm in San Andreas and went off to college, got a political science degree, and my first job out of college was a reporter for the Calaveras Enterprise.
Ah.
And I didn't really think I was going to be a journalist, but I loved that job that I got over the summer so much that turned into a 6-year stint at the Enterprise. And that went from cub reporter to lead reporter and eventually to the editor of the Enterprise. And unfortunately, when I did become the editor, I got a little bit of a better look into the finances, and it was really struggling given that the internet had come on and advertising was plummeting. And so I made the decision after about a year as editor to look for a job in the water industry, and I was hired by Calaveras County Water District in the management team over there. And I worked for 6 years at CCWD. I seem to like the 6-year number for the different career types that I do. And so I really learned a lot about grant writing, water use efficiency, capital improvement planning, hydroelectric power, treated water, treated wastewater. Did a lot of legislative advocacy in Sacramento and even in Washington, D.C. And after 6 years at CCWD, I looked for a general manager position and was hired by the Utica Water and Power Authority.
How long ago was that?
That was 4 years ago now,
wow.
In 2020.
Is your board nervous in 2 years that the 6 years is going to come up?
I have heard some grumblings that when 6 years comes, we're going to have a heart-to-heart. So
or nail your feet to the floor.
That's right. That's right. So I have been just so fortunate to be part of Utica for the past 4 years. We have a small team, 10 people work there, and they're just incredible people, hardworking people, very talented, taking on a system that used to be owned by PG&E and maybe had 25, 30 people that it took to operate it back then. So, so what is Utica?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's confusing for me. There's UPUD and City of Angels and CCWD, which I think is on this side of the county, and of course Utica. So could you explain the relationship? Absolutely.
So Utica Water and Power Authority is a joint powers authority, and it was formed in 1995. But the system that JPA was formed to run was much, much older, and it was actually built by the gold miners way back in 1850s is when the system was first built.
So we're talking about 170 years old.
170 years old.
Wow.
It's crazy to think about how old that system is. And the reason they built this water supply system was they wanted to have a reliable water supply for the Angels Camp and Murphys and Vallecito area so they could mine year-round. And they needed that consistent water that was high pressure so they could do hydraulic mining and keep all of their equipment going and all of the things needed to support the mining industry. And so what they did is first they were using Angels Creek, which kind of starts up in the Murphys area and runs down through Angels Camp. Well, that goes dry every year pre the Utica system. And so they went farther up the hill and they connected Mill Creek, which is Moran Creek, which is kind of the Blue Lake Springs area, and Love Creek, if you've been out Love Creek Road. They come together near Avery and they go into Hunter Reservoir. And so that was the next water source that the gold miners tapped. That got them into early summer until that was down to a trickle, and in some cases goes dry. And so they realized if we're really going to be able to have a year-round water supply, we need to get to the Stanislaus River. And so they extended their flumes and canals another 6 or 8 miles up the canyon wall of the North Fork Stanislaus, and they connected to the large river down in that deep canyon. And that is really the reliable water source they needed. And so that pathway that the gold miners built, all of these kind of on-grade, on-contour line canals and flumes, that is what we still use today, 170 years later, in much the same form. We really don't have a lot of upgrades from the materials that they were using back then.
And who are the groups that you're providing the water for?
So the water that we bring down the hill through the flumes and canals, we are primarily focused on the JPA members. And we have 2 members right now. We have the City of Angels Camp, and we have Union Public Utility District. So the city's a fairly small footprint. You just think of the City of Angels Camp and that town, and that's really what they're using. They also provide water to Greenhorn Creek Golf Course from our system. And then Union Public Utility District is headquartered in Murphys, and they have a much larger service area. Starts in Murphys, goes down to Douglas Flat and Vallecito, 6 Mile Village, and then it actually goes out Red Hill Road, all the way past the dump, all the way past all that irrigated pasture you see to Carson Hill on Highway 49. And so they have a very large service area, and they have about 105 ag customers who are irrigating with that untreated water, and then they have about 1,700 residential and commercial customers who are metered.
And how many are in Angels Camp?
Angels Camp is closer to 2,000, maybe a little bit more.
So you've got about 4,000 users, and that comprises how many? Have I seen 10,000 people or so?
Yeah, so by customer count, we're in the neighborhood of 4,000, but if you apply the population multiplier, so one customer might be a household of 2 or 3, something like that, then we're around 10,000 people in the community rely on Utica's water supply for their day-to-day needs. And one thing that people need to keep in mind, that I certainly keep in mind, is there is no plan B. There is no backup water supply right now. It's the canals and the flumes, and there's no secondary supply that's currently hooked up. And so that really just emphasizes the importance of this system, and that it functions every day and every hour of every day, and how important it is for us to be good stewards of that system.
Right. So just to reiterate, Utica doesn't have its own ratepayers. You provide just to these 2 folks, these 2 groups, City of Angels and UPUD, that actually has the ratepayers. They're completely reliant on Utica to provide that water through their system.
That's absolutely right. And so the one thing that we do have in addition to the water supplies, we do have one really good revenue source, and that's hydropower. And so we have 2 hydropower plants. One is in Murphys, which you can see just when you're leaving town on the right. There's a little pond and then a concrete structure and a switch yard. And then the other one is nestled in downtown Angels Camp on Booster Way. Real hard to see, it's inside of kind of a big tin building. And so those plants generate power, and we sell all of our power to PG&E, and PG&E then takes that power and they distribute it to all of us along with their other sources. And then they pay us by the megawatt hour, and depending on if we have a wet year, so we have lots of water coming through, we make a lot of power, we might make up to $1.8 million a year in power sales. And then in a really bad year where there's an extreme drought, we might make only 600,000. So there's a very volatile revenue source for us, but when we have good years, it can be a really good thing for our community. Now, where do those ratepayers come in? If we cannot cover the costs of operating the water system and our powerhouses with the power revenue, that doesn't cover all of those O&M expenses and CIP and reserve contributions, then we look to our JPA members and we ask them to contribute equally, 50-50 share of whatever that board adopted deficit is. And so, for example, in the year that we're in right now, fiscal year 2023-2024, each of them is contributing $290,000. And that really varies by water year, how much hydro we produce, and what projects we're working on that year.
Right. So just to clarify one more time, it says your name says water and power, so you're in the power business as well, and that's where this FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, comes in. We think of you as a water provider, but you're also a power provider, and therefore you follow under these regulations by FERC, I guess we'll call it for short.
That's right. And so FERC is a federal agency. They're based in Washington, D.C. They have offices in San Francisco and across the nation. And they were created to regulate power producers across the United States. So if you had a nuclear power plant, or you had coal, or you were doing wind or solar or hydro or natural gas, any of these different power producing facilities, when FERC came into being 100 years ago or so, all of these power producers were folded under that regulatory framework. And so what that led to over the years was an annual set of fees that you pay to pay for those regulations, and then also a series of licenses that are issued. And in most cases, the FERC licenses that are issued, which are the federal government authorizing you to generate power under a set of conditions. That's what the license is. It's a plan for operating, and it takes into account all the different stakeholders who might care about the impact of that project. So that license is generally for 30 years. In some cases, you could see a 40 or even a 50-year license. And during that license period, once it's issued, whatever's in that license is what everybody abides by, and you really don't see changes to the operations of that facility. But when you're nearing the end of your license period, in our case, our 30-year license expires in 2033, so in about 9 years or so from now. When you're 5 years out from that, so 2028 for us, you have to let FERC know we are going to apply to relicense this project. We are going to apply for another 30-year license. And that kicks off a very long, very complicated,
Expensive?
very expensive process where you open up the project to all of the stakeholders once again, and you ask them, do you have any concerns about the operations? Do you have the environmental concerns, cultural concerns, recreational, historical? What do you want to be studied on this project? What impacts do you want them to look at? And so what happens is, with FERC guiding this process, you go through years of studies and consultations and meetings and things of that nature, and you're paying a lot of engineers and other consultants a lot of money to go through all of these different study requests and find the information to satisfy what's being asked for. And so it's a very expensive, very lengthy process, and it happens every 30 years. And so a licensee that's being responsible needs to put money away so they can afford that when the time comes. And in our case, we looked at it a few years ago, and our estimate for the expected expense is up to $10 million to relicense those two hydropower projects.
So just put it in perspective, what in a given year, what are the annual revenues from all sources? How much would that be approximately, you think?
So in the average year, I'm going to say a water year one, because that is supposed to be the average water year. We're bringing in that $1.8 million in hydro revenue between our leases, our sales to some water contractors that get water directly off the ditch. Only about 25 of those. That's maybe $45,000. Then the lease revenue, some interest income, things of that nature. We're in the neighborhood of around $2 million, maybe $2.1 million in revenues. And
then the contributions, both from both of your...
That does not include contributions.
Right.
And our annual budget is around 3.1, and then if we have, let's say, a grant or a big project, maybe that gets up to around 4 million, just kind of between 3 and 4 million right now is where we tend to see our annual budget. So you can see that just with our own revenues that we can bring in, in a good year, maybe around $2 million, and our budget being at least 3, but in many cases more than that, we're facing about $1 million deficit in most years.
Right, and therefore that contribution that comes from either UPUD or from the city to make that up.
Right, so we're always looking at what our options are, and we are always trying to work with our partners to keep that contribution as low as possible, because we know that when residents of Murphy's and the UPUD larger area and Angels Camp, when they look at their water bill, there's going to be a line item that says either the Utica fee or the water supply fee. And
I see that on mine. I'm a UPDU customer.
Yeah,
Right.
So you'll see, and in your case, it's $18 a month. This is what we are collecting in order to support Utica's system maintenance and getting that water down the hill to us. And on the city side, instead of a fixed rate for everybody, which is how UPUD does it, the city charges maybe $13 a month for the smallest meter customers, like a 5/8 or 3/4, like your standard residential house.
Right.
But then a larger, let's say 2, 3, 4-inch meter for like a school or a business, they might pay substantially more than that to the Utica fee. So they're using more of a volumetric approach to that fee. And so, depending on the water year, that fee has been as high as $490,000 a piece, and then as low as, I think in the very beginning, maybe only $40,000 a piece. And so I think our goal, moving toward the next 5 years, is to find a reliable, fixed amount that kind of takes all the averages into account and smooths out the need, so we're not up here and then down here with the need for that contribution. And what that will do is it will really help the city and UPUD determine rates over the next 5 years, and it will also help us know what's coming instead of negotiating that every year, and then we can budget based off of that and make sure that we have appropriate reserves and capital for our expenses.
Right. So just to try and untie this knot a little bit more, you're primarily a water company, but to try to keep our rates down as ratepayers and users, you are in the power generation business with what, 5 dams, is it?
We have 5 dams and 2 hydropower projects, and the system as a whole is 27 miles long.
Right.
So there's a lot of canal and flume and some natural streams that are part of that conduit.
Right.
Yeah.
But then by wanting to generate the almost $2 million of revenue, that's where FERC comes in. If you were just a water company and not power, then these FERC regulations you wouldn't be subject to them. So to keep our rates low, you've sort of had to play ball with FERC on these 30-year contracts, and they're pretty involved, as you said.
They're really involved, and I want to share a little bit of history to kind of inform how FERC ties in and also how it has impacted ratepayers. So one of the things that I learned, still as a newer general manager, is from 1995 until around 2014, 15-ish, 18 or so years of our existence, 0 contributions were asked of both the city and UPUD. So the powerhouses were paying for 100% of the costs of running the system. So for a very big chunk of time, nearly 20 years, there were no contributions that were asked for so you could call it free water. The other thing that happened during that time is a $4 million loan that was taken out to buy the system from PG&E in coordination with CCWD was paid off by those power revenues. And so these powerhouses have really performed. They've paid off that loan plus interest, and they've provided no-cost water to the JPA members for more than half of our existence. But in 2014-15, when the drought was getting really bad, what happened was the water just wasn't coming down the hill, and we weren't making enough hydro. The reserves were expended, and then from then on, costs have gone up. The system maintenance has needed to be invested in more heavily. We've needed to start saving for the FERC relicensing or maybe the FERC exemption. And we've also just seen everything that we do cost more and more. And I know that you and I have experienced that, with our families, and just groceries and gas and going to the lumber store.
But water too, huh?
But water too, because in order to maintain a system, we have to buy lumber, materials and supplies, and we have to make sure that system is kept in good working order. So one of my goals as a manager and one of the board's goals at Utica is always looking for ways to try to operate more efficiently and effectively and reduce costs, because if we can narrow down that deficit that we seem to have every year right now and reduce how much that grows or maybe even shrink it, that's going to have a direct impact on what we ask for from our member entities of the JPA, and that has a direct impact on all of the ratepayers who pay that monthly water bill. And so that's why we're so committed to this FERC exemption application, because what that would do is it would allow us to no longer be on that every 30-year cycle where we have to relicense with FERC that we think may cost up to $10 million. It would be a one-time process where we would seek an exemption from FERC. And an exemption is really kind of a one-time forever license. And instead of FERC having jurisdiction over the entire 27 miles of our system, which is what they have now, it would limit their jurisdiction to just the powerhouses themselves, pretty much draw a line right at the fence. So the turbines themselves and the switch yards, those would still be under FERC jurisdiction. They would still regulate them. We would still be accountable to the federal government for how those are operated and their impacts. But once you get outside of the powerhouses, the flumes, the canals, the dams, the penstocks, all of those other components of our system, that would fall out of federal jurisdiction and it would be assumed by state agencies and they would regulate us moving forward.
So the FERC exemption, and I see that it's called the conduit. What you're talking about are the canals and the flumes and whatnot that emanate from these powerhouses, either above or below them. But FERC, even though they're an energy regulator, has full purview over those, of surveying those and regulating those as well.
That's right, and I find that to be really interesting because, you know, it is really focused on the energy production itself, but with these licenses, in many cases, FERC also assumes regulatory authority on the actual water conveyance infrastructure. And so I will say that once a year, the FERC inspector comes out and they don't spend a whole lot of time at the powerhouses, if any time. Where they spend their time are at the dams.
Okay.
And so they are going to be walking those dams, they're going to be looking at our valves, they're going to be looking at our SCADA control, looking at our spillways, looking at everything having to do with dam safety. And where I feel really confident telling my community, because I live in this community too, I live in Vallecito, that these dams would continue to be operated safely if FERC were not inspecting them, is that on the same day that the FERC inspector comes out, we also schedule the state dam safety inspector. And that inspector works for Department of Water Resources, and the particular division of that is Division of Safety of Dams. And they are the best in the nation when it comes to the state level dam safety regulation. And so they're out there and they're looking at all the same dams and all the same appurtenances.
On the same day?
On the same day. And they're providing us with the same report on what they saw. And so, you know, I believe that there's some redundancy there, quite a bit of redundancy, in fact. And
Unnecessary in your?
I believe it's unnecessary. And you know, I've talked to some of the head people of DSOD, Division Safety Dams, at the state level, and I've said, do you have any concerns about regulating the small dams that we have if FERC weren't to be involved? And they said, absolutely. We regulate huge dams that FERC isn't involved.
Yeah, like Shasta Dam or whatever, or any number of things, right?
Yeah, so Shasta's going to be taken a look at by FERC as well. So is Oroville. But I'll give you an example that always kind of blows my mind. Hetch Hetchy, O'Shaughnessy Dam, is a huge dam. If anyone's seen it, you know, it's a giant concrete arch dam. And it's built in a national park, and it's built by an act of Congress, and it is exempt from FERC, so it is only regulated by DSOD. It's not regulated
Even though it's in
by
a
FERC.
national park.
And it does, you know, feed powerhouses downstream, but it is not under FERC. And that dam, you know, is holding 300,000 plus acre feet. Compared to mine, the biggest one I have is 150 acre feet. So in terms of like the catastrophic failure potential, if DSOD can handle that, they can definitely handle our dams. And they're confident in it, we're confident in it. So that's one of the things that I just want to assure the community. We take dam safety extremely seriously, and we do not see any lapse in that. If FERC is not regulating it, we will continue to be an excellent dam owner, and the state will continue to do an excellent job regulating those dams. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got ratepayers. We're generating $2 million, Utica, $2 million of revenue from that. But the FERC licensing costs $10 million a year, or every 30 years, and that $10 million would be passed on to the ratepayers completely if you weren't able to generate well, I mean, it's going to be passed on anyway. So the exemption, maybe you've got some expenses that you'll maybe talk about on the one time, but then that prevents having to pay $10 million or whatever it'll cost in every succeeding 30-year period of time.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. This exemption would be breaking that 30-year cycle. It would be a one-time process. I don't think the exemption would cost the full $10 million. It is less of a process than the relicensing is, but many of the things that we would have to do for a relicensing, we are doing for the exemption as well. And that includes things like environmental surveys and looking at how we're impacting the animals around us, making sure that we're checking in with the tribes. Maybe there are some new important sites that have not been identified and aren't properly protected, historical management, working with the State Water Board, working with the U.S. Forest Service. There are a lot of different folks that we are going to be checking in with. We will be doing some studies as part of the exemption. In fact, I just was on the phone today about a yellow-legged frog study that we need to do soon because the water temperature is going to be right for that, and I don't want to miss that window. We'll be looking at all kinds of things. This very well could cost millions of dollars before it's all the way through, and we're looking at probably a 4-year process, and we're about a year into that. So probably another year until we go from a draft application to a final application. And then FERC, they might be able to process it when it goes back to DC in a year or so, but it seems like they're delayed and it's taking closer to 2 years. So we're probably 3 years out from knowing for sure if we've had this exemption granted or not. But let's say, even if we do spend several $1 million going through the process of pursuing this exemption, making sure the stakeholders have their questions answered, and that we've updated all of our studies and made sure we can be a really excellent manager of this system and a great steward of the environment, because that's very important to us to be a good steward of the environment.
Right, provide water, but also be good stewards of the environment.
That's right, that's right. So even if we do spend several million doing that, it's the last time we would spend several million doing that, and we would avoid the up to $10 million relicensing, and then 30 years from now, whether that's my kids or in 60 or 90 years, our grandkids, what's that 10 million going to become? Probably
100 million.
15, 20, 30, 50?
Yeah.
I can tell you the Calaveras County Water District's relicensing is expected to be 60 million plus. And what's that going to be in another 30 years? Right. So in my view, if we have an opportunity to go through a process that we didn't create, right? The exemption process was actually instituted by Congress. They recognize that their staff at FERC, they can't regulate all these small agencies. They don't have enough staff to be responsive and to really do a good job. They need to focus on the larger projects. And they also just recognize that the state and local agencies are well equipped to work better with small agencies
right.
like ours, especially in California. I think we can all agree that California may be more rigorous than the federal government in many areas. And so
including water.
Including water.
Yeah.
And so if anything, I think that falling under the state and local regulations and those agencies, I don't see anything falling by the wayside when it comes to protecting the environment while providing our community with water.
Have you had any informal discussions with FERC that you would be eligible for such? These things have been granted before, these exceptions. So do you have a general sense that yours is the type of project or system that would be eligible for such an exception?
Absolutely, because I would be a foolish manager if I didn't have a pretty good idea of whether we were going to qualify before I took that to the board and recommended that we move forward. And so after we studied this a few years ago and really looked at all the different options that we could pursue moving forward that were different than that $10 million relicensing, and the exemption was identified as the best course of action at that time if we could qualify. What I did is I actually started calling staff in Washington, D.C., and eventually I got in touch with the person who is in charge of exemptions across the nation. And I said, here's our situation, here's what we're thinking about. I know there's 3 types of exemptions. Which one do you think might fit best? And do you think that we would fit that? And over the next few months, I sent more and more information back, and they reviewed it. And I really appreciate FERC staff putting that time in. And they kept on asking me for more info, and eventually they finished their review. And they said, while we can't speak for the commission, because the FERC commission, they're going to make the final call. That's like the board of directors,
right.
Versus staff. But at the staff level, we feel like you're an excellent candidate for a conduit exemption. And we encourage you to, follow this process. Congress has put this in place. We as staff are mandated to execute the will of Congress, and so we will support you as you go through this process. And to their credit, they have. Whenever we've had questions, they've answered those quickly. And they've even, looked at some of our application materials to make sure that we are doing everything that we need to. And so when we do finalize our draft applications, which I expect to be before the end of calendar year 2024, that's our goal, and we submit that back to DC, it's going to go to this guy and his team. And then he's going to be the lead person, and he's going to bring other specialists in as needed, and they're going to review this application. They're going to check back with all the stakeholders that we've been checking with, and then they're going to make a determination at the commission level, hopefully within a year or 2 years at the most.
Right. And as I studied a little bit in anticipation of our time together today, do I understand that if this were a new system of this size, the Utica system, that you wouldn't fall under these FERC guidelines?
That's a really good point, and that's another reason why I feel like this is the right path for us. Is because of some rules that have changed since, we existed before FERC was even
Almost before the federal government.
Yeah. So we were swept under FERC along with everyone else, but newer systems that are built today that are small, 1.4 megawatts, 3.6 megawatts, which is like what we are, in most cases, they would apply for an exemption while they were building the powerhouse, and when they went online and started generating power, they would be under an exemption from day one. They would never have to go through the every 30-year licenses as we have had to.
Right, so you're grandfathered in an unfortunate way just because of the age that you fell under the original rules.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I think that, back when FERC was created and they were bringing everyone under that fold, I think that there were many fewer energy producing plants. And so it made sense maybe at the time, but now that there are so many more and so many small ones, and the high cost of maintaining these licenses, and, if we have to pay up to $10 million and then know that 30 years from then it's something much higher than that to relicense, at some point these powerhouses maybe just don't make sense anymore.
Right.
And the way it is now, if you can bring in $2 million, that's subsidizing the cost of maintaining all those flumes and all those ditches and all those reservoirs for the ratepayer, because if the hydros were turned off and we were making no revenue, all the costs, 100% of the cost of that water system would be the ratepayers, because there's no other source of revenue at that point. Right. And so our goal is to make the hydros as cost effective as possible, so the most revenue that they make as we can find can not only cover the cost of keeping the hydros going, but can then subsidize the cost of water.
Right. So let's talk about this FERC exemption. It's a conduit exemption. I know there's several types, but for various reasons you chose a conduit exemption. Part of that process is you needed to open it up to public comment. Tell us a little bit about that period.
Yeah, so the process that FERC mandates, it really is up to Utica, the applicant, for the first, year or so of the process. So they set the guidelines, but it's up to us to be the project manager and to follow those guidelines. And so what we did is we worked on a draft application, and we have two projects, so we did two draft applications, one for the Utica project, which is from Avery to Murphy's, and then the Angels project is from downstream of Murphy's to the town of, or the city of Angels Camp. So two licenses, two applications. We hired consultants, we hired specialty legal counsel that really knows FERC well, and we put together hundreds of pages of applications per the FERC requirements. And it's all in draft form. And on December 20th of 2023, we circulated those draft applications to about 65 different interested parties, potentially interested parties. We sent out a link to the document, and we said we would invite you to read these and provide comments within about 3 months. The comment deadline was March 25th of 2024. And I will say this, before we even circulated those drafts, I spent 6 to 8 months calling all the people who I knew were going to be interested, who would need to have a say in this process, letting them know, hey, this is what we're thinking about, these are the impacts, this is what role you might play, let me know what your early thoughts are, and so nobody was surprised by getting that draft. They knew it was coming. We already had started to build those relationships and start to figure out what that path might be. So moving into early 2024, just a few months ago, in January on the 25th, we held a joint meeting. So a lot of these folks came, Forest Service, State Water Board, Fish and Wildlife, tribal representatives. They came to that meeting, and we presented our plan, we presented our applications, the impacts. Then we took whoever was interested on a site tour, and we showed them the actual projects. And then we reminded them, hey, on March 25th, in a couple months, we would like your comments. So when the comments came in, I think we have 28 or 29 comments right now. 24 of them are in support of this exemption. And I'm just so overwhelmed by that support, because this is the County Board of Supervisors. This is all the public water districts and sewer districts in the area supporting us. It's prominent business leaders in the community. It's agricultural users. We have the support of both tribes that are active in this county, the state-recognized tribe and the federally recognized tribe. And then we also got some, what I would characterize as neutral letters, so the Forest Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they kind of said, here's our process. We would like you to maybe do some of these studies. We'd like you to work through these plans, maybe do some updates to your existing plans. So they asked us to do some things that will cost money and will take time. And then we had one letter that raised concerns. And so the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, they're concerned about, is the environment going to be protected? And so we certainly wanted to address just those concerns, and we have done so.
Okay, so we've only got a few more minutes left here, so you have to address that concern by Cal Sport.
Spa, yeah.
Okay, and so what's next? What's the balance of 24 hold for you? How much staff time is involved, and what is it going to entail?
So this process is my number one priority from the board. I'll be putting most of my focus into this, and my team is absolutely going to be supporting that. So we are going to be really focused on this. We're going to be doing quite a few studies. We're going to be updating plans. We'll be putting applications in to the Forest Service for a special use permit. We'll be working with State Historic Preservation Office and others, and we're all moving toward gaining momentum toward the submission of the final application expected before the end of this calendar year. And once that goes in, then FERC takes the reins on this entire process back in Washington, D.C., and they will then guide it from when that application is submitted all the way to when it goes in front of the commission and they make a decision on approving it or not.
Right, okay. So 2024 promises to be a very busy year for you.
It promises to be a very, very busy year. Quite honestly, I'm stretched pretty thin as it is because...
Yeah, because you've got all your other general manager responsibilities to run the system.
I've been spending the last few weeks, in budget development, trying to get that together. We still have grant programs that we've gotten that we're going. We still have to make sure the water comes down the hill, doing those maintenance projects. So there are a lot of things that we've taken on. We're very proud of those things, but one of my goals is maybe say no a few more times, use that 2-letter word, and make sure that we have enough time to really focus on what could be, the biggest, most impactful thing that our community has ever done for the cost of the water supply for Murphy's and Angels Camp.
Is there any role for the public at this point to be involved in the process, or is that something that may be needed farther down the road beyond this original 90-day comment period?
So we were fortunate in that some members of the public have already put in support letters, and that was huge. I do believe that there will be a role for the public, maybe closer to the submittal date of the final application. We may want to have a little bit more letters of support. We also are asking for support from our federal representatives. So Congressman McClintock has already supported this. We'd like to see Senator Padilla write a letter of support for this, and we'd like to see Senator Butler write a support letter for this. And so it may be that as they're making those decisions, if their constituents were calling and encouraging them to do so, that might help us get their support on this. But I think that more than anything, we want the public, if they hear about the FERC exemption, to just remember we're not giving up our hydroelectric powerhouses. We're keeping them, and we aren't becoming unregulated wild, wild west. We are actually just falling out of federal regulations in many cases, but we're falling into state and local regulations that are really already in place, and will continue to comply with those very stringent environmental laws. And we're happy to do so because we want to be a good steward not only of the water supply for the community. We take that responsibility very seriously. We really do want to be a good steward of these reaches of stream that we impact, the hillsides that our canals and flumes flow across. We want to make sure the wildlife is protected there. And we want to make sure that we are balancing all of these different interests and needs in a way where we can try to be just a really good system owner for all of the interested parties who might comment on how we operate the system.
Sure. Any final thoughts before we close?
I'm just excited that we have this opportunity. As someone who's worked in water for 10 years now, there's so many times when you're just looking at costs going up and going up and going up, and to have an opportunity to actually permanently eliminate one of your biggest costs. That's almost like a unicorn.
With no sacrifice of quality or environmental protection.
And to have a really clear pathway to a win-win for everyone involved, that's just so rare. And so for us to have identified that and be able to have the financial resources and the staff and the right team to go after that and pursue that on behalf of our community, I'm excited. It makes me excited to get out of bed in the morning and go into work and make sure that we are pushing toward a goal that is going to be an absolute game changer for this community. And I want to set up my kids and grandkids for a water supply that's affordable for their future and for the future of this county. And I think this is one of the biggest steps we can take to do that.
That'd be great. And apparently there's a resource page for anybody who's interested. It's uticawater.com/exemption. That's a good spot for people to go to.
That's right. Yeah, just go to uticawater.com and find the exemption, or go right to that link. You'll be able to watch a video there. You'll be able to read all the draft application documents, see a frequently asked question list. And once you browse through that page, I think everyone will have a real good idea of what's going on and why.
Great. Joel Metzger, thanks so much for spending some valuable time. I know you're busy these days, and thanks for illuminating a pressing issue for us as a community and as a ratepayer. I appreciate the fact that you and your staff and your board are making strong efforts to provide quality water with environmental protections at the lowest possible cost. This is David Bowman again. Thanks so much for joining us for this public discussion at Public Access Television. We hope you have a great day.